Welcome to Bryan on Brass. My name is Bryan, and on this video, we're going to talk about how we're going to build our perfect brass warm up. So, the first step for making our perfect brass warm up is something that as brass players we don't do enough of, and when we're consistent with it, it brings a lot of great results either to our practice session, our performance, or our rehearsal, and that's buzzing. You need to incorporate some type of buzzing into your warm-ups. So when we're talking about um, buzzing, it can just be as simple as just doing long tones. It can be doing articulation exercises. It can be going through scales, so doing a combination of tonguing and slurring. It could be sirens, where you're kind of um, going from the extreme low and high registers in one kind of consistent solid buzz. Whatever the case may be, you need to buzz. And what we don't, we kind of get it out of the habit of not being consistent with the buzzing. What happens is we end up having more issues with note placement in terms of how the notes feel when we're playing on our horn. We have difficulties with tonguing. We have difficulties of pitch recognition. Buzzing helps so many of those problems that we tend to find in our typical rehearsals. When we are buzzing, one, we want to make sure that we're attacking it with a lot of diaphragm support. We want to be conscious of the pitches that we're doing. So as you're buzzing, you should be able to audiate the pitches in your head of what you're trying to replicate on the mouthpiece. And we want to avoid as much pressure as possible. So you can use your thumb and your index finger, and that is as much pressure that you need to use whenever you're buzzing. If we have a grip like this, or we're too far onto the shank, that's bringing too much of the mouthpiece against your face, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. We want to try to make sure that the buzz is free blowing, that it feels comfortable, it sounds comfortable, and that you're facilitating the fundamentals that we need to produce those articulation, those quality of tone onto our horn. We don't make sure that that translates from our buzzing into the horn. So the next thing we need to focus on is long tones. There's no shortcut to long tones, but there's different ways that we can practice on long tones that may make them a little bit more enjoyable. So the old school way is maybe the Remington, where you get your horn, you start on consonant F, and you go chromatically down or up, so you can span kind of all registers of the horn and playing in nice, long, consistent notes. So Remington, I use that all the time for my personal warm-ups, but there's many different ways you can do long tones in different ways. If you're trying to learn a new scale, I feel the best way to do it is through long tones, and that's whether it's in the upper register or the lower register of that scale. Having a consistent, nice, long playing with a purpose of, all right, I'm going to try to make this note as in tune as possible, or I'm working on the dexterity of understanding the relationship of the notes and the scales. You can do that with your long term. You can do that with your long tones practice, but there's other ways too. There's books that you can do, whether it be through the Arbin book or some other method books where they may have some like first studies where you're focusing on a lot of whole notes at like maybe 60 to 70 BPM. Those can be considered long tones as well. whenever I am doing long tones, I do like to make sure that I have a tuner in front of me and that I'm constantly paying attention. Is this note in tune? Because another great thing about long tones, you can really understand the tuning of your horn, but you can also understand your personal tuning and what you need to do, adjust armature wise, what you need to adjust slide wise to get those notes in tune. And you don't get that understanding if you're not doing long tones with a tuner and with a purpose of, I'm going to make sure that this note is in tune. I'm going to make sure that this note is as free playing as possible. When we're talking about range, long tones help a lot in range. Whether we're talking in the extreme upper range, upper register, or extreme lower register, long tones helps you, one, get the confidence to hear how those notes sound, gets the feeling for those notes, but also allows you to get the strength needed to facilitate playing extremely high or extremely low, or if there's just notes in between. If you're trying to slowly build out your range, long tones is another great way to slowly get up to the point where those notes become comfortable. Next is lip slurs. So whether it's just a simple lip slur pattern or if you use some type of lip slur book, lip slurs are very, very important to the development of a brass player. Um, the thing that people use a lot for lip slurs for in terms of their playing is for range, for getting to those upper register notes on your brass instrument. Typically anything above concert F and higher, that's what we like to really utilize these lip slurs for. But we also want to focus on lip slurs on the smoothness of our playing. We don't want to have a whole lot of changing of the armature as you're going through different registers. You don't want to manipulate the jaw so much that it's causing a blip in your sound or is causing a change in the quality of your sound. We want to make sure that when we're doing the lip slurs, they sound as free and as loose as possible, but also that we're paying attention to the pitch and the tuning and making sure that that air is that big catalyst that's pushing our sound forward for those lip slurs. So whether it's just a simple lip slur or maybe it's a passage out of the lip slur book or method, you want to make sure that you're constantly doing some type of lip slurs in your warm-up. Next thing we have is scales. So it's very similar to long tones. Scales doesn't have to be such a boring process. Maybe if you're a middle school student, you're focusing, on your 7 major scales, and then your big three is something, your B flat, concert F, concert E flat. Maybe those are the ones that you're constantly in rotation, but you want to constantly, start striving for those other scales. Maybe you're a high school student and you're tackling those 12 major scales and trying to perfect them for either for college auditions or your all county auditions or whatever the case may be. But you never stop working on scales. So there's many different ways to augment what you can do with your scales. So let's just say you're a high schooler and you've gotten your 12 major scales down. You can do them with arpeggio, tonguing up, slurring down. You got it in 2 minutes or less. Great, wonderful. Now there's other ways you can augment that practice. Now we can find scale books, so things like unisonal scales or the complete scale compendium. You can use those to make sure that you're not just going through patterns, but you're able to see those patterns in music or in exercises and be able to quickly identify, okay, this is in the key of whatever, and then you have the facility to play through those. But also you want to start looking into the relationship of those major scales with those minor scales. So now you can see, all right, I'm taking these notes from this major scale, how do they relate in this minor scale? What is different? Now you can focus on the flat third, the flat seventh, or whatever the case may be, so that you can quickly identify the difference between major and minor. Let's say you are a college level student, you've gotten your major and minors down. Great, wonderful. Now you can work on playing those scales in different ranges. So for instance, let's say you're a euphonium player. All right, well, if you have euphonium with the 4th valve, the compensating valve, now we can start on the E flat below the staff and work on the dexterity of getting that E flat from below the staff to that E flat on the staff to the E flat above the staff, and then we can take it further to the E flat even higher than that. So there's always different ways you can take your scales, augment them, expand the range on them, or use them in very different fashions. So in some way, scale should always be a part of your warm-up process. And finally, sight reading. So this is something I feel that we do not do enough in our practice sessions, is put sight reading in there. And with me, I have a lot of different method books. So it's easy to just find a book, go to a random page, give yourself 30 seconds and just go for it. And especially with books as big as like the Arbin book, where there's many different exercises in there, or things like the Melodious Etude book for trombone and euphonium, where you can just go to a different etude, very different lyrical exercise, and just go through it. Sight reading makes sure that you're constantly active in terms of thinking of the music, of thinking of rhythms, understanding intervals. And when you're constantly doing that, once you get new music, it's going to be way easier to quickly jump into whatever piece you're playing. But I encourage you, let's just say you've gotten very consistent with that. Well, we can augment the sight reading process now by either focusing on keys that we don't see a lot, like your concert A, your concert B. When we get into those keys, when we get to more of our sharp keys, or we can augment our sight reading even further by changing clefs. So we can either look at things in treble clef. If you're a euphonium player, that's a typical clef that sometimes we read in, but we can challenge ourselves as trombone or tuba players to read in treble clef. French horn can start learning how to read in bass clef, especially since it's the lower register of that French horn typically can read in that bass clef. So now you're challenging yourself to read in different clefs and understanding the right relationship of the treble and the bass. Or if you're a trombone and euphonium player, you might want to start looking into tenor clef and be able to read in tenor clef and be able to do that. Or if you want to get even better as a sight reader, we can work on the sight transpositions. So if you are a trumpet player, maybe who's in an orchestra where they're typically reading in sharp keys or in orchestral keys, there may be instances where you're given a piece that is in the key of C, or given a piece that's key of E, and you have to transpose on the spot. So if you consider yourself a very proficient and good sight reader, let's try to incorporate transpositions into our sight reading process. And that's just going to make you a much better student in terms of pitch recognition, dexterity, and be able to put anything in front of you and be able to quickly identify, all right, this is our target note, this is our tonic. How do I relate this tonic into what I normally read in my standard band literature? When it comes to warming up, your process for warming up is going to vary from individual musician to individual musician. It may change from what trumpet players may focus on, what euphonium players may focus on, tuba players, horn players, so on and so forth. But the 5 standard concepts that I just outlined can work on any of those instruments. Now, the beauty of a warm-up, of tailoring a warm-up, is that you're focusing on what you need to work on. So you may be at a point where you're past the basic lip slurs. Then you can start going to more challenging lip slurs or lip slur melodies. You may get to the point where, hey, I've gotten down my major scales, let's try to tackle these minor scales. Long as you're incorporating all of these elements into your warm-up, is going to make you a well-rounded musician. Additionally, this doesn't mean, just even though there's these 5 different concepts, that doesn't mean your warm-up needs to be 45 minutes long or something like that. Typically, if I'm not working on any significant literature, or maybe if I'm not currently playing in a group, my warm-up will just be a fundamental block, and I may spend 30 to 45 or an hour on the same concepts that I've just outlined, just because I don't have a performance coming up, and that is a great time to just really focus on those fundamentals. But even if you're in the context of a band rehearsal and you have 10 minutes to warm up, you can utilize all of these concepts still, and there's ways you can integrate each. So you can integrate your scales with your long tones. Well, if you're doing your long tones and you're going through different scales, you're hitting both of those categories. Sight reading, if you're in a band setting, most band rooms have some type of method books, and that's the way you can quickly take 30 seconds, look over a piece in a method book, and then go forward. So there's many different ways to either shorten or elongate these concepts to make it work for your situation, whether you have 5 minutes to rehearse, to warm up, excuse me, or 30 minutes to warm up. Wherever the case may be, you can utilize all of these elements into your warm up and be effective as a brass player. So hope you enjoyed this video. Hope it was informative. Once again, my name is Brian. This is Brian on Brass, and I will catch you on the next one.